I've got this joke that I can always use, but I don't always know how to apply it, but I think this one really applies to you. Is there was once this law student, and he attended the Latin class, but he only attended 2 classes, and then he didn't go for the rest of the year. And at the end of the year, he went back and he said he wants to write his exams. And the professor said, but there's no way you can write the exams. You only attended 2 classes. You didn't even write tests, nothing. You can't. But he persisted and he insisted, and in the end, the professor thought, well, he only attended 2 classes. Let him write it. What will he know? So he wrote the exam and he got 98%. So the professor called him in and he said, well, how did you do it? He said, that paper was so easy. And the professor was a little bit upset and he said, well, if it was so easy, why didn't you get 100%? And he said, I think the first 2 classes confused me a bit. Now, that's what happened with me when I started my research on PERCO and what the universities wants to achieve with procurement is I will go to the Public Finance Management Act, and similar to the Parliament, you know that the PFMA will say this act is relevant to the Parliament where it refers to Parliament and then it never refers to Parliament again. So now what's relevant to you guys and what not? And that's what I found when I started researching is actually what is your legal mandate? Where do you find it? Where's your basis that support you? And from that concept, I thought that maybe I should rather discuss with you what is a procurement environment and why do we not talk about procurement anymore, but we actually talk about supply chain. And how can you, within your environment, implement it if you understand the role? But before I continue, I want to latch on with what Prof. Jansen said yesterday morning again, is it all depends on leadership. And sometimes I think we sit in our chairs and we look at our leaders and expect them to take the lead. But who's sitting below us looking at us as their leaders, expecting us to take the lead? And that was what I yesterday wanted to convey to you at our panel discussion, is that maybe we have to look at ourselves and see what we can do and where we can lead to make that difference. And so in the discussion today is going back again to the centralised concept, is with the National Development Plan, it was said that we can only achieve economic development in this country. We will only be able to achieve our development goals if we fix our engine room. And Trevor Manuel got a lot of flack because they asked him, now what's this engine room you're talking about? And he said, that's government. Government needs to fix themselves. And although, again, as I said, that 2% of the class, I don't really know where higher education institutions in terms of procurement stand with the legislative frameworks. The only one that I could find was, funny enough, in the new regulations, reporting regulations, where there was, again, funny enough, twice they mentioned procurement in the new regulations. So they do see procurement as part of the finance and reporting function. I just want to mention that to you. So for us then, the message is then, how do we fix ourselves? And what I want to discuss today with you is the normal, as we said yesterday, the buzzwords, is that first of all, we need to decide where do we fit in. If we sit here and we're from procurement or we work with procurement or supply chain, where do we fit in? What is it part of? Is it part of management? Is it part of line function? Is it part of finance? Is it part of HR? Is it part of strategic management? Where does supply chain fit in? Once we know where it fits in, the question is then, what do we do? What are all the elements we are responsible for if we say we do procurement? The next one is then, who executes supply chain? How do you implement it? Who's responsible for it? And then lastly is then, how do you execute it? And you'll remember from yesterday where I mentioned is that we do have, as a country, we are very blessed to have a lot of rules that tell us what we need to do. Where we have failed however, and that's why we fail in implementation, is we don't have the tools, the how-to. We don't really provide the staff members with how then do you do it. We tell them what they should do. And we've seen it yesterday with the case studies that Sonia presented. Is yes, the department did not adhere to the rules, but not once in that report it was said how. Nobody was told how then do you do it. It was just said what they didn't do. and that's where I think sometimes we fail. It's easy to say where do we sit, what do we do, but how do we do it? And today's discussion is basically to provide you with the toolkits that you can use. Where does supply chain fit in? Now, okay, this is a very busy slide. It's something I prepared for National Treasury. They're also busy fixing their engine room. And the first question we asked ourselves at National Treasury is, if someone comes to us and asks us, how do we manage finance in this country? Will we be able to, on a page, tell them how we do it? And this is the page that we agreed to. But the most important element I want to show you is that Treasury has agreed that finance do not only consist of accounting and accountants. Finance actually, in government terms, or even you guys being organs of state or constitutional institutions, by the way, what are you? Higher education institutions. Now, I'm serious, I don't know. Are you a public entity? Are you a government enterprise? Are you a constitutional institution? Are you an organ of state, though? Because you are defined by legislation. Okay, so you're other. But most importantly, and I don't know how many of you guys that are here are in the finance components of your organization, is that from a government perspective, we have 9 disciplines for finance, not just accounting. And the first one is what we call governance. That's normally your jazzy parts. That would be your intergovernmental arrangements, your interaction with public entities or entities that you create within your institution, trading entities, that would be those separate bank accounts that you have, I suppose discretionary funds or whatever you call them, sponsorships, your treatments of irregular expenditure and unauthorized expenditure, and then your management of financial misconduct. Normally that's your governance stuff. It doesn't sit anywhere, but they form part of finance. And then you get into more hardcore type of finance, and the one that they've acknowledged is internal control. Now, under internal control would be what are your systems, what are your control environment, how do you identify your, what controls do you put in when you identify risks, all those issues. Another element or discipline is enterprise risk management, and the other one is internal audit. Now, what I want to mention to you guys is even though they fall within the finance discipline sphere, they don't necessarily sit all with the CFO. You guys know that. For instance, risk management and internal audit report directly to your accounting officer. They don't sit within your finance component, but they are seen by government as finance disciplines, and government give us rules on how to implement those disciplines. Management accounting is how you do your budgeting and reporting. Financial accounting is obviously once you spend your money, how do you record it and how do you report on it. And then, very importantly, they've also identified supply chain as a financial discipline. Now, again, I want to mention that although we say supply chain as a finance discipline, it means we get our rules from Treasury on supply chain. It doesn't mean supply chain necessarily have to sit with the CFO. By virtue of its nature, in terms of the PFMA and the MFMA, they did put supply chain with the CFOs, but government is moving away from that. They're busy taking supply chain out of your finance components, and the reason being is, and you'll see when we get to the SEM system, is that supply chain is more than just finance. It's also strategic, and it's also your assets. So it's something that we just need to consider. And then the other disciplines are your asset management. Now, I'm sure you guys all work on accrual accounting. Do you use GARP or GRAP? GRAP, cool. Okay, so then you understand how important it is to manage your assets, and we'll have a discussion on assets because assets are seen by the treasuries as part of supply chain. And what I've picked up in institutions where I worked at is that they manage their assets at different places. Your asset registers normally sit with your accountants, and then your asset movements normally sits with, well, what I've picked up sits with supply chain, but then the actual maintenance of the assets sits somewhere out in line function. So there's no owner for assets. And that's why we struggle in the end when we do our financial statements. And if you look at the Auditor General reports on our assets, we get a lot of flack. Okay, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. And then also your electronic systems. Finally, Treasury acknowledged that you do need systems to implement finance, and they've realized that you actually need a discipline. And then lastly, how you deal with your payroll related to your personnel system and those types of things. But, and your face value forms would be under there. But the most important thing with the 9 financial disciplines, and especially you guys being from higher education institutions, is the reason we've identified that at National Treasury is for each of those disciplines, we're busy building a professional qualification. So there's competency. If you go to the Accountant General's website, you'll see that we've already developed competency dictionaries for each of the 9 financial disciplines. And we're now busy preparing training material, and we're busy professionalizing the field. So, for instance, with accounting, we're working with a professional body, SICA. For supply chain, we're working with SIPS. For risk, we're working with IRMSA, I think. So it's just how we structure it, but we are going to work with professional bodies, and we are busy preparing, professionalizing the field. And you all know about the School of Government, so the intention is that it will roll from there. Once we understand then where supply chain sits, so we've understand now it's part of the finance discipline. It doesn't necessarily have to sit with the CFO, but it's a finance discipline. The next question is, what is supply chain? And why do we talk supply chain and not procurement? And the reason being is, in the past, procurement was a reactive function. Management will sit, they will prepare their budgets, and then they will need to procure a service provider, or they need to buy something, and then they will go to the procurement office and say, buy it for us. What we've realized with the new way of budgeting and management is that basically when you start identifying your need, when you start preparing your budget, you actually already need to know how you're going to spend, where you're going to spend your money in the industries and the markets. And the reason being why it was forced on us is this whole concept of preferential procurement and BEE, is that we can't now just reactively go and buy stuff. We actually proactively need to start planning. And in my research, I did find a paper that the department issued for FET colleges, a paper on supply chain. And all the elements in there is similar what's in here, is that they said for supply chain in a higher education institution, you have to work with demand management. That's when you identify your need. Acquisition management, that's how you fulfill the need. Contract management is then how you manage the service. Logistics management is once you've got the product or the service, how do you maintain it? Asset management is if you have an asset, how to manage it through its life cycle. Then disposal management is then how do you get rid of it if you don't want it anymore. And then from a governance perspective, they have risk and performance management. It's basically where you manage your risks and you identify on an annual basis, how can you improve yourself? So that's the whole governance cycle of supply chain. The toolkit that I've left on your table, stop there. But yesterday, from my discussion with some of you ladies, I picked up that some of you also work with infrastructure and construction. So I've just showed you that there is a discipline for infrastructure and construction as well. We just deal with it differently because of the CIDBA requirements. if we ask ourselves what supply chain, then that's what you see there. The most important thing, however, which I've picked up is that, again, where government is very good is we've given you the rules to say this is what supply chain should be, but we never told you, now, how do you implement it? How do you institutionalize it? How do you make it part of your organization? And that's why I've included an extra leg, which we call institutionalization. And in there, I've made provision for where you say generally what supply chain means for you as an organization. So you will say, for instance, I don't know, you procure what, 1.2 billion a year? Really? I thought I was making a joke. But then that's your buying power. That's your power in your organization. Your regulatory framework, and that's part of my 2% of the joke, is I struggle to find your regulatory framework for you. Your strategy, how supply chain will be strategized. Now, that's normally where you bring in your preferential procurement. If you, for instance, say, we want to encourage the unemployed youth, and it's something we've done now at a municipality, is they had a problem there with unemployed youth. Is we've identified that that municipality spent 400,000 a year on toilet paper, buying toilet paper. So what they've done is they've decided, well, seeing that we spend so much money on toilet paper, it costs 25,000 rand to buy a toilet paper machine, toilet paper making machine. They bought 3. They employed 6 of the unemployed youth. They opened one of their clothes warehouses. And they've trained those guys how to make toilet paper. Now, they're now making toilet paper for the municipality, but the intention is to grow them in their own little business, that at the end they can actually now be owners of a toilet paper making firm. Now, I know it's a stupid example, but you guys hear what I'm saying, and that's what happens with an SEM strategy. Is once you start talking about spend, that's the things that you do under your strategy. Another one that we've picked up, for instance, is at most government institutions, they have, and I'm sure you guys also have it, the thresholds. We'll say under 2,000 you do petty cash, 2,000 to 10,000 verbal quotes, 10,000 to 30 written quotes, then informal bids and then formal tenders, something like that. What most institutions started doing then is just buy under 2,000, then you don't have to follow the procurement process. What we've picked up is that it costs you about 750 rand to process an invoice. Since you get the invoice till you pay it, that's your cost in man-hour and your equipment that you use, and that's about 750 rand. So if you procure stationery, which is normally a small item, under 2,000 rand, but you have more than 1,000 transactions a year, it means that you've spent 750,000 rand. It cost you 750,000 rand that year to purchase stationery. Where if maybe you had a term contract, you would have had 12 transactions a year because you'll only have 1 invoice per month. Now that's part of what your supply chain strategy needs to do, is you have to look at your buying power, you need to look at your spend, you need to look at your trends, and then strategize how you can be more effective. Now, you see, guys, this is, we haven't even started with procurement yet. This is just how you strategize, how you use your spend. And just think if we can use it more effectively, how more effectively your organization would be. There was one municipality, I won't mention the name, where they've employed one service provider. There's only one guy in the municipality that can do it, that topped the trees. And the number of transactions to top the trees, it cost the municipality, I think, something like 400,000 rand in transaction costs to pay the little invoices for each job. But I think they paid the guy out 250,000. So it cost them more, where if they know there's only one guy, geez, that's a sole supplier. You sign a contract with him and you pay him once every month. You with me? So, okay, that's what your supply chain strategy needs to do. Supply chain principles, normally it is the constitutional principles: fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective. The most important thing about that is, I don't know how many of you guys work with Professor Phoebe Bolton's book on government procurement, but there's a chapter in there that's really brilliant, where she says those 5 principles are actually a balancing act. They're like those, you know, those magnetic balls that you have and then you click them and they hit on each other. But they're not always equal. Because if you have an emergency situation where a person can die, then you won't necessarily be very transparent, you won't necessarily be very cost effective, but you have to be efficient. You're with me. And what she says in that chapter is just how you balance those principles. And sometimes with the Auditor General, where I picked it up, is they want to weigh them equally. And it's not always possible in procurement. So that is just, if you guys to know as a tool, is how to argue when those type of things happen. Then your SEM policies is basically will be your SEM system, will be in a policy document, and that's the rule book that you work with. Your SEM guidelines, that would be the things that National Treasury calls practice notes. A practice note does not have the power of law. So if you do not comply with the practice note, it's a matter of non-compliance, and there's an internal control weakness that you need to fix. It's not an irregular expenditure. Your SEM unit, that's part of your institutionalization, is what does your SEM unit look like? What are their roles and responsibilities? And very importantly that we need to understand with an SEM unit is that they work interactive with the users, because the users are line function. So the SEM unit cannot assume responsibility for the whole function. They may assume responsibility for their system. So they are in charge of that. They're the champions. They will have their SEM policy, but who will do what can depend on where the function sits. Capacity development is obviously how will we capacitate our supply chain staff and our users. Very importantly then is our delegations. As most of the institutions do have very good, I think they call it user manuals or SEM systems or SEM manuals, but it's not delegated. So everything still sits with the accounting officer or the CFO. And then it makes implementation a little bit difficult. And I'll show you now how simple a delegation system can work. Then your committee systems. So this is basically your bid committees, and that's normally for tenders. So you'll have your specification committee, evaluation committee, adjudication committee. What we have picked up in government institutions is normally your tenders 30,000 to 200 or 500,000. You don't follow a formal tender process. It's an informal process. We found that there's a little bit of abuse happening. So what we've brought in there is what we call a bid quotation committee, is where actually your evaluation and adjudication committee forms one committee. And they then deal with those types of transactions or bidding processes, which I've also provided in here. And the reason why I'm just listing them for you, as you'll see later on, is for each of those, there's a set of rules. And I can make those available to you, is that then you also have to have a stock take committee, disposal committee, then an SEM abuse complaints monitoring and evaluation committee. And I'm going to discuss this a little bit later on for you guys. General committee matters is basically what your secretariat will look like, what will be your general committee rules, what's a quorum, how do you keep your minutes, how do you send out your invites, those types of things. And then lastly, how do you deal with this, how do you resolute disagreements between your committees? Who will make the final call and what's the process to follow? Part of your institutionalization is then your SEM governance. Those are things like your ethics, your fraud and corruption, what are fronting, how do you manage fronting in your organization, what would be your codes of conduct, how will you manage compliance, will it be your control unit that will come and do a checklist check, or will you include compliance checklists in your SOPs, those types of things. And then lastly is your optimal technology system, is what are the technology systems that you use? Do you use, for instance, LexisNexis to do your verifications, or do you have another system that manages your database of suppliers? What I've picked up when I went onto Perco's website is they've got a database of suppliers. I'm sure you guys use them. But that's a type of technology systems that you will then confirm in your SEM manual is what do you use. Now, my concern is that I've picked up at most institutions is all of these things are addressed in some way or another, but it's not condensed into one manual. So it's very difficult to go and find it. And what happens then, and I'm not sure with you guys, but in the organizations that I work in, is that when the Auditor General gets there, everyone's scattering. They're just looking for information and files and folders. And I say, why is it not in a book? Just have your book and give it to him. And it's as simple as that. Now, unfortunately, I don't have one for universities, but we do have an SEM manual like this for municipalities and provincial departments. It is a document that belongs to government, so I'm sure you guys may have access to it. So I'll make it available to Davey, and then you guys can have a look at it. It's in any case, it's on some of the organizations' websites, so you can get it there as well. That you just condense it into a manual. We then move to demand management. Now, demand management, for you guys that asked me yesterday about roles and responsibilities, demand management is something that's driven by SEM, but it belongs to management. So when management sits down and determine their budgets for the year or the 3 years ahead, and I've looked at your reporting regulations, you do it very much in the same way that government departments do it. When they do that type of planning, supply chain need to infiltrate those meetings and say, we're going to sit there because we want to hear what you're going to plan so that we can advise you from a supply chain perspective what's possible and what's not possible. Otherwise, we're actually sitting with not credible budgets. And the frustration is everyone blames supply chain for not achieving their goals, but they never talk to supply chain when they planned. So that's just my practical experience that I've picked up. So that's why I'm saying demand management is something that supply chain will drive, but it belongs to management. So you need to go and inculcate that culture with them. And part of demand management is where you'll have your standard bidding documents. That's where you'll have your database of suppliers. And you'll have that thing that we call strategic procurement. Now, strategic procurement, I've already mentioned the principles. It may sound very ingewikkeld. It's not. Strategic procurement is basically where you see what you spend your money on, what your transaction costs are, and how can you be more effective. That's strategic procurement. Or strategic sourcing. And then your specifications compilation happens with your demand management. And again, demand management, specifications, the responsibility is management. But supply chain need to guide them. And especially on specifications. And that's what I found at most institutions that I work at, is that with specifications, just use the set we used 3 years ago. Or that municipality used those specifications, just ask them if we can use the same, copy and paste and use the same. Now, that is what this one says. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Is that specifications is where your most important process for procurement begins, is with your specifications. And when your specifications are determined, and that's again something that can be driven from the supply chain unit, is that the specification or the user that developed the specifications must also tell you how you're going to manage your contract, what risks are you exposed to, and how you're going to manage those risks. And they must do it up front when they prepare their specifications. So that you don't, in the end, when the award is being made, suddenly they say, but we can't work with this one because in the past they didn't work. Or we can't work with this service provider because that's a risk. Well, you should have identified that up front. Or try and fix the contract when the award has been made. Those things had to actually have been addressed there. And I think that's one of the most neglected portions of supply chain. Acquisition management is basically your procurement processes. For acquisition management, the most important thing I want you guys to understand on acquisition management is that you have your thresholds for procurement, and most people think those thresholds are your procurement processes. It's not. Procurement processes is where you identify for your commodities what your procurement form would be. Say, for instance, if we purchase professional consulting services, legal advice for litigation matters, we will have a term contract with a database of suppliers. That's also a procurement process. For IT, we will standardize on certain IT requirements. So if we need to renew our Microsoft licenses on an annual basis, it's not a deviation from normal tenders. That's actually your procurement process because you standardized. And I think what I've picked up in most institutions is they didn't know that. So everything that's not within the thresholds, they see as a deviation. It's not. If your procurement process has been identified for your commodities and it's in your system, it's not a deviation. Then there's different forms that you also can work with, not just your petty cash, written quotes, verbal quotes, informal bidding and formal bidding, which is it's an administrative process, basically. You can also have transversal contracts, and I've noticed on the PERCO website that some of you do have it. It's where PERCO basically go and purchase a service, and you use that same contract or service provider, and you have a service level agreement with the service providers. You can have what they call piggybacking, is where one organ of state went out on tender and purchased a service, and then you take over that service as well. For consultants, there normally is a specific procurement process. You can have a roster basis of procurement where you use people on a roster mechanism. You can have a rotation basis of suppliers. You can have a database of suppliers. Okay, for finance leases, there's just a few different rules that you need to apply with. Banking and IT, there's just a few different rules that's also relevant to those procurement processes. So importantly is just put it into your system, give the rules there, and say how you're going to manage it. The thresholds I've discussed. IPS is your, if you have an e-procurement solution, that will be part of your acquisition management processes. And then your generic bid issues is then just how do you open your tenders, close your tenders, how do you extend validity periods, it's all those type of things. But as I said, there's a document that explains all these. This is just a summary on a page. There's a difference between contract management, contract administration. Contract management sits with line function, contract administration. It's either the SCM unit or it would be, if you have a contract administrative component, it will be there. Logistics and inventory management, asset management, I'm sure you've got your own rules. I don't know, currently with supply chain, does that sit with you or does it sit somewhere else? Okay. But in terms of the new guidelines, asset management and logistics and inventory management is a part of supply chain. Risk and performance management is just how you manage your risks. And again, on that document that you can have access to, you'll see that we've identified what's your pre-bid risk, mid-bid risk, and post-bid risks. Your pre-bid risk is basically when you prepare your specifications, what do you need to look out for? Mid-bid is before you make your award, what do you need to look out for? Post-bid is when you're busy with your contract, what do you need to look out for? So you'll get all those tools. And then infrastructure and construction is just basically the same processes, it's just a set of different rules in terms of the CIDBA and their grading requirements. Delegations is just where you take the same one-pager that I've given you. Now, how we do it in government organizations is we've got this page, and on here we'll have the references in your SCM manual where we deal with it. You swap the page around, your delegations are here, and we give you your items, so you can see immediately who's doing what. The delegation framework toolkit that we use, we actually have where we indicate in your delegation framework who initiates something, who then do it, who recommend it, who approve it, who execute it, and who monitors it. Because those are the 6 functions that happens with any task that you're busy with. So if you can use that delegation framework, it will really assist you in even understanding your organizational structure and requirements. Okay, we've gone to the where, we've gone to the what, we look now at the how. The how is, this is what I've said would be your different procurement thresholds, is where you identify your petty cash, written quote, verbal quotes, written quotes, normal tenders, and then your different processes that you will follow. And what you'll see with this toolkit is for petty cash, you only have 4 processes to follow. Where if you get to a tender, you'll have like 9 processes. And the reason being is just that you put in more controls because your risks are higher. From there, then, you design a standard operating procedure. So you'll have, say, for instance, I've used an example of a bid committee. You'll say in your bid committees, we've said what are the rules for our bid committees. We'll have an evaluation, a specification, evaluation, adjudication committee. And then we'll say for the specification, evaluation, and adjudication committee, who should do what. You will then have a process flow with the tasks in there. And from that, you will then move to your next toolkit, which is a table that will say, from step 1, identify the need. What's the action? Complete the tender request form. What's the template? Here's the template that you need to complete it in. Who must do it? What's your standard? Where's the requirement? Go and find it in your SCM manual. And then your remarks. You with me now? You understand what I'm saying is we understand now where you fit in, what you need to do, how you need to do it is you'll have standard operating procedures. Your standard operating procedures will have a process flow. Underneath it, you'll have your document with your templates. And then lastly, PERCO's potential role that I've seen, and this comes back to what President Zuma said about the centralization of procurement, is basically the concept, and I think it didn't come through well, was just that there will be a central body that will monitor supply chain because it's popping up as a risk. Now, currently, it will not affect you guys. It will affect provincial, national and municipal departments and organizations. They will have to change the legislation, though, and they will have to change the constitution, though. So that's still a long process to follow. But what the intention was is basically in the olden days, you would remember we had tender boards. Now, what a tender board in the olden days actually did is they just monitor how do you implement supply chain. Where there's consistent risks or trends that you pick up, you will put in mitigating factors. But most importantly is where there were complaints, disputes, or appeals, you could go to the tender board rather than going to court, which would then really, really be much more cost effective for both you as an organization and the suppliers. So this is something that I would like to promote for PERCO, is that they maybe consider establishing a board like that, which they may call, I called it a Monitoring, Evaluation, Complaints and Appeal Board, a MECA board. And what I just wanted to say is similar to the bid committees, there's also an SOP that I've designed for it, with the process flows of how things will be communicated to that committee. And then what their roles would be is then to promote fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective supply chain management, monitor and report on that, advise on better procedures that they pick up, initiate, develop, and propose better procedures, and then also deal with appeals, complaints, and disputes. Okay, that was really quickly. I suppose there's no room for questions.